My name is Tracy Anderson. I'm a business development manager for Skanska USA Building. I'm also a member of Cornet New York's Public Policy Committee, which is hosting today's event. We're really excited to introduce today's panel of highly esteemed life science subject matter experts. Our panel will be moderated by Yasmeen Ahmed Pattie, principal at East Egg Project Management. Our panelists are Bill Harvey, managing director at Newmark, Matt Weir, Senior Vice President of Commercial Asset Management with Taconic Investment Partners, Christina Derose, Director of Real Estate and Space Management at Weill Cornell Medical College, Ken Schoenfelder, Director of Real Estate for the New York Blood Center, and Carlo Yuvienko, Vice President of the New York City Economic Development Corporation. We want to extend a big thank you to all of our speakers for being here with us today. Just a few quick housekeeping items before we get started. Please note that all lines will be muted for the duration of the event. If you have a question, please feel free to drop it in the chat box, which you can find at the bottom of your screen. We'll be monitoring the chat for your questions, and we'll get to as many as possible in the last 10 minutes or so of the event. And I think that that's it for announcements. So without further ado, I will turn it over to Yasmeen to kick us off.
Yasmeen is having technical problems. Can you hear us, Yasmeen? She can hear us, she just can't call in, I think, or the audio is not working.
It looks like she's on mute as well.
I don't know if there's maybe a call-in number that you could maybe call in, Yasmeen, like to do the audio over the phone.
Did you guys want to perhaps maybe put up the timeline that we had discussed before, and then maybe we could just kind of get into it that way? Yasmeen, it looks like you might be back.
We still can't hear you though.
We want to start with intros?
Yeah, why don't we start with intros?
Yeah, why don't we do that? Matt, go ahead.
Sure. So Matt Weir, Taconic Partners, we're a New York City focused developer and landlord. We currently have over 2 million square feet of commercial development in various stages of active, either pre-dev, planning, construction, or repositioning. And a large chunk of that is in life sciences. We have 2 projects currently underway, both on the west side of Manhattan. The first is the Hudson Research Center, which is a 320,000 foot building. 180 of it, so over half, will be wet lab space. And then our most recent project, 125 West End Avenue, 400,000 square feet. And we look forward to talking more about those as we get into it.
Christina, why don't you go next?
Sure. So I'm Christina Derose. I'm the Director of Commercial Real Estate for Weill Cornell Medicine. Weill Cornell is the medical school of Cornell University, and it's affiliated with New York Presbyterian Hospital on the Upper East Side. I currently oversee our 3 million square foot portfolio of both life science, education, and clinical/medical care. Prior to coming to Weill Cornell, where I have been for the past 5 years, I was a Senior Vice President at the Economic Development Corporation in its real estate group.
That's great. Carlo, why don't you introduce yourself?
Great. My name is Carlo Yuvienko. I'm a Vice President of Life Sciences at the New York City Economic Development Corporation. NYC EDC, for those who aren't familiar, is a nonprofit corporation that functions as a quasi-government organization and sole mission and alignment with the city's goals for economic growth, predominantly through real estate development, but also through programmatic initiatives like life sciences, a lot of which life sciences is involved in.
Ken, you want to go next?
Sure. I'm Ken Schoenfelder. I'm the head of facilities and real estate at the New York Blood Center. Many of you know us as a local not-for-profit that collects blood and distributes it as well. We are almost a national company now. We have divisions in Kansas City, Missouri, in Nebraska, Minnesota. We serve the Delmarva Peninsula, Rhode Island, Southern New England. In addition to the blood collections, We've always been involved in research from the early 60s when the company was founded. So we've developed hepatitis vaccines and all kinds of things. And that's why we're so excited about the new project we have. We're looking at a 595,000 square foot research facility in the building, in the area where we currently are now. And we'll talk about that later. Thank you.
That's great. I just quickly introduce myself. I'm Bill Harvey. I'm a broker at Newmark. I got involved about 10 years ago with the life science sector here, the burgeoning life science sector here. I was actually tabbed by Yasmeen, not ironically, to assist with a requirement that I eventually became the New York Genome Center. When that deal closed in 2012, we all thought the next big deal was really inevitable, but it took a couple of years. And just to kind of show you what a kind of a tight circle this is, it happened at one of Matt's buildings at 619 West 54th Street. It was the New York Stem Cell Foundation, and I think that was in 2017, Matt. Since then, the life science sector has really grown kind of exponentially. We're now the landlord agent for King Street Properties InnoLabs building in Long Island City. We brokered a deal over the summer for Botanic Properties to acquire another redevelopment site also in Long Island City. Currently talking to a handful of other owners and would-be owners about a couple of sites in Manhattan. We're also pretty active on the tenant side. I would just ask for all of the attendees if you could mute your audio until the Q&A starts. There's a little bit of feedback that could be a little distracting for the speakers. I'll kind of step into Yasmeen's shoes here for a second, and I think everybody can see the timeline that I kind of described very, very loosely with the Genome Center. But I think life science in New York City really predates even that deal. I think that was kind of viewed as one of the linchpins, but it really got started in earnest a couple of years before. It was really an effort by the Bloomberg administration to jumpstart life science. I think there were a number of kind of economic development imperatives that Carlo might be able to speak to a little bit better than me. But it would start off in 2004 with the Downstate Incubator in Brooklyn, which is connected to SUNY Downstate Hospital. That kind of grew into an RFP that became the Alexandria Center for Life Science on the east side. There's two towers developed in 2010, 2014 that were really kind of the sun around which everything in life science revolved for a long time. A lot more competition recently. We'll get into that, I think, in a little bit later. Heartland Biospace, which was started by a professor at Columbia named Sam Sia, and it's still going. I think really gave a lot of people the confidence that there was really something more to life science in New York City than a series of one-off transactions. Heartland Biospace is an incubator. It's only about 3,500 square feet. Pound for pound, it's actually one of the really more kind of productive labs in the city. Companies like Epibone have come out of there. I know that Heartland Biospace was looking for more space fairly recently. I know Sam's kind of dual position as the founder of Heartland Biospace can often tug on his time as a full-time faculty member at Columbia. So there's probably more to discuss on that later. I think kind of more broadly, the role of the incubators is very important in the development of the life science cluster here in New York, and perhaps we can get into that a little bit later. I think one of the other kind of watershed moments for the development of the cluster happened in December of 2016. And that was when both the state and the city jointly committed to over $1 billion in life science initiatives. The project that I'm involved with at InnoLabs was the beneficiary of a tax abatement. That's of the $500 million that the city committed to life science. A big chunk of that was in the form of a tax abatement. Perhaps we can get into that in the Q&A section. Alexandria Launch Labs opened in 2017, followed shortly by J Labs, which is a division of Johnson & Johnson. Biolabs came a year later. Between those 3 incubators, that's about 100,000 square feet. When you add on the incubator at SUNY Downstate, it's even more. You see, I think the last logo in the timeline is Alexandria's most recent Launch Labs facility, and that is opening, or if it hasn't opened already, up at Columbia University Medical Center. I think this is where Yasmeen was going to hand it off to Carlo.
To Carlo, yeah, thank you. My apologies for the technical difficulties. But yeah, so the other, what I was going to say is the other really big move that EDC did in 2016 is hire Carlo, who's done really, really great things and is really well go-to at EDC. So if you want to continue the timeline from where you started.
Sure. Yeah, happy to. Maybe I could tell a little bit more about my particular background and how I got into the EDC, and then how that plays into what the EDC has been doing. So as Bill and Yasmeen said, I started with the EDC in January of 2016, right around the time when Yasmeen and others were together with the EDC, we're concluding an infrastructure study, taking stock of not just the existing supply of wet lab life sciences real estate in New York City at the time, which included the Alexandria Center, but also where the demand for that type of Class A and Class B wet lab space could go in the next 10 years, depending on how the city intervened. And so I got in beginning of 2016 as we were taking the findings from that study and synthesizing a plan that later became the mayor's Life Sci NYC $500 million 10-year plan. But I want to take a step back for a minute here and sort of put the question to the audience, given the fact that many of you may not be familiar with life sciences as an industry, of why life sciences in New York City. And it's sort of the classic puzzle that EDC has wrangled with even since the beginning of this timeline, and even before that with earlier efforts of New York City having so many rich assets among its academic institutions, among its independent research institutions like the New York Stem Cell Foundation, that folks, whether you're in government or in the private sector, were asking themselves, well, why has New York City not matured and taken shape in the way that Boston, Cambridge, or San Francisco Bay Area, or even San Diego has flourished with respect to the life sciences industry? And it's something that EDC has always tried to figure out. Before 2016, there were a lot of sort of toes in the water and big and small hypotheses tested, both in the Alexandria Center on the east side being one of those bigger hypotheses that clearly has been pretty validated to date. But also, to Bill's point, more humble efforts that still pound for pound indicated strongly to us at the EDC that we should continue to invest in life sciences. And of course, I'm referring to Heartland Biospace there and Sam Sia's heroic efforts in standing that up against, some would argue a mountain of odds against that being a success. But sure enough, the academic community in New York City, combined with the entrepreneurial talent from both local and non-local, were attracted to New York City, of what it had to offer, not just in that early career scientific workforce, but also the workforce of our regional partners, in whether it's New Jersey or in Westchester, and then also the core science that was birthed out of, and is continuing to be birthed out of, our academic institutions. Calliope being one of the bigger ones in recent memory that's taken root in the Alexandria Center, but now we're starting to see additional companies sort of take birth. And maybe Matt, you can speak to a little bit of Hybricell and how they've taken root in Hudson Research Center later on. So that brings us to 2016 and late 2016, where EDC launched LifeSci NYC, which really consisted of primarily three levers of cash and prizes, if you will. To a variety of stakeholders. First would be connecting research, the core research, to industry. And for that mission, part of the program, we allocated $150 million in city capital dollars that are bond finance dollars that would go to nonprofits, or restricted to nonprofits, for either construction or equipment. The second primary lever is, and the majority of the funding would be in the form of $300 million in tax abatements through the Industrial Development Agency that is managed through the EDC. And so the executive director of that program and the supporting staff sit within EDC, specifically within our strategic investments group. And that's very similar to the Industrial and Commercial Abatement Program, or ICAP, that is issued as of right, depending on eligibility of sites and projects, but has the ability to go deeper depending in terms of incentives, not just in timeline, but also in the extent of the benefit, depending on the programmatic definitions of the project. And so that is not necessarily an as-of-right program, but more of a discretionary program that we evaluate on a case-by-case, application-based basis. And then the third is programmatic dollars that would help program these sites or program entrepreneurial support, similar to some of the programming that was offered by Heartland Biospace in yesteryear. And so since then, we've seen a flurry of activity, mostly in the incubator establishments, as you see here on the timeline. But we are starting to see larger scale developments like Bill's and King Streets in Long Island City with InnoLabs, but also the Hudson Research Center. 345 Park Avenue South, which is another EDC project that we worked on with Deerfield through an IDA tax abatement. All of these programs, I'd say, one, first off, and this will probably be hammered home later in the panel, that a lot of homework went into and diligence went into these projects, and this is sort of not not to be taken on lightly, right? But also, the programming is just as important for these sites as the wet lab features of the site. And that's something that also I look forward to hearing the rest of my fellow panelists speak more to as well. And so with that, I'm going to hand it back to you, Yasmeen, to take over. Thanks.
Yeah, thank you. And again, apologies. So I'm just going to add in, and if, forgive me if it's already been said, but, when I started at EDC, so I don't think I introduced myself. I'm a project manager, real estate and economic development consultant. My firm is called East Egg Project Management. I was at EDC from 03 to 07, a lot, sort of when this sort of initiative or this concept was started. So my first project at EDC was to write the RFP where Alexandria was selected, and that turned into the Alexandria Center, right? So I feel like I've watched this sector grow over these last 18 years now. And in the beginning, it was in fits and starts, right? There would be something like the first building of the Alexandria Center and then nothing for a couple of years. And then, but certainly recently, the momentum has just gotten so much stronger and there's so much activity. We're going to talk about supply and demand. And then I think, and so let's talk about, if Carlo talked about what efforts the city has made, we wanted to also talk about what really comprises a life science cluster, right? And so we've got small startups. We mentioned a couple here that come out of our universities. We've got what, 12, not however you want to count it, but we've got some amazing institutions all around the city. Not to mention Long Island and the surrounding area. So there's the young startups that come up. There's the big pharma, as we know, in New Jersey and in Westchester, and they're all locating here in New York now, especially, for example, at the Alexandria Center. And then the institutions themselves, right? So we've got a couple of representatives from the institutions here. But let's start with Bill and talk about what kinds of spaces you work with and what kinds of clients.
Yeah, so it's a great question. I think especially for I think an audience like this one, many of you are kind of new to life science. There's a tendency, I think, to think of life science space as somewhat monolithic, but in truth, it's actually very different. I mean, there's a lot of different kind of types of space. Kind of, I was on a call this morning and we were kind of joking about this, but at the kind of lower end, there's something called dry lab space. We often kind of refer to this euphemistically as glorified office space. It's office space, but
it's office space. Right.
perhaps with like a little bit more power. There's a real eye towards bioinformatics with dry lab. It's really interesting. If we have time, maybe in the Q&A, we can kind of come back to the specific field of bioinformatics, because it's kind of at the confluence of what I would call biotech, but also more generically just tech. So that kind of on the lower end, there's a lot of different lab space. There's biology labs, there's chemistry labs, which actually tend to be a little bit more expensive because of the fume hoods and the venting. We have in the market right now, there's incubators, there are accelerators. I think more kind of general is the comment, and I think that this actually surprises people too, is that when you think of a building that's a specific building designed for lab, it's really only about 50% of it that's lab, and that ratio can tilt a little bit. But if you think about what scientists need, it's they also have a need for offices, they have a need for conference space, et cetera. On the higher end, in terms of cost, vivariums, animal research facilities. There's a couple of tenants in the market right now looking for vivarium space, but that's kind of what we're talking about. I think there's a couple of Christina, certainly, and Ken can talk about perhaps maybe some of the more institutional uses.
Yeah, so thank you, Bill. Christina, can you add to that in terms of what kinds of spaces you work with, how they, if and how they differ from, say, commercial spaces, and also from for example, the spaces you worked with when you were at EDC with the Alexandria Center?
Yeah, so I'm also an alum of EDC. I think there's actually quite a few of us here. So yeah, I think in terms of location for an academic medical center, they're a little different in that, obviously we have established researchers, and so I view ourselves as, in terms of if you're talking about the three legs of startups, big pharma, and academic, we work a lot with both of them. A lot of our professors and researchers start their own startups, sort of based on their academic research that happens in our institution, and then once they commercialize it, they then are starting up their own individualized startups. And then we also work a lot with big pharma. Big pharma funds a lot of our research as well that we do in our laboratories. And so there's a lot of relationships between those three. So in terms of location for us, or just the type of real estate we use for laboratories, if we're not looking at laboratory space on our campus, we have approximately 1 million square feet of research space. As an academic institution, when we're looking for space off campus that's research, we do look for actually a large amount of it. A lot of the startups will take 3,000, 4,000, 5,000 square feet, something small. For us, we have to take a large chunk, actually, partially because A lot of academics want to be near the medical campus. That's their home. That's where they have some of their research. If they're teaching, a lot of them are teaching, or, you know, Cornell is known for its physician scientists. And so a lot of our scientists are practicing physicians, and they're in the hospital a lot as well. And so they kind of want to go back and forth. So if we can't get space right by the medical center, which is always at a premium, we try to create a large location somewhere else so that those researchers that are there, there's a coherent reason why they're all there. Maybe they're all chemistry researchers or biology researchers, but also that they're not being felt like they're sort of being banished to Siberia, to create that sort of cluster within themselves. But then they also do like to be, as I said, near the academics and the big pharma. So I think that's part of sort of what we are looking at when we're looking at space, aside from just sort of the regular building mechanics. You know, we want a lab building. We want a building that ideally is turnkey, that, you know, we don't have to spend a lot of money to move into.
Okay, great. So Ken, let's get you in here. Can you tell us about the Blood Center's activities? You know, I think most people think of it just as the place where you go to donate blood, but there's a lot more to it, right? So tell us about that and how that affects the space that you look for and occupy.
That's absolutely correct. Thanks. You know, as I mentioned earlier in the introduction, the Blood Center has been involved in research since its inception back in the early 60s. More recently, though, what we've done is we've been leasing space, to kind of build on what Christina said, because we're right near Weill Cornell and Memorial and Rockefeller, and not too far from Mount Sinai. So we've been leasing laboratory space and office space to third parties for a few reasons. You know, it helps us buffer our space needs when we have excess space and excess lab space. It helps us amortize, you know, some of our investments in the large scientific equipment, you know, electron microscopy and all kinds of analytical equipment. We have a fair-sized vivarium, so some of the people who are third-party life sciences tenants in our buildings are using all those facilities. So it's really helped us a lot. In more recent years, this has almost been more of a core business for us, if you will. You know, we're actively, I wish we had more space. We're actively looking for people to collaborate with and not just rent space to them anymore. So the reason for our project, our new project, is number one, our building is worn out. It was built in 1930 as a trade school, as a high school. And you know, at the time, in 1960s, we made it a state-of-the-art research facility, but 1960s are a long time ago. So for us to attract scientists and for us to expand our role as a accelerator, if that's a good word, you know, to use, you know, we really need a new facility. So that's the reason for it. Pure and simple. We're in a great location. We're right in the community with the other academic institutions do spin-off for-profit startup companies. We have some tenants that start with literally about 200 square feet of bench space and a little bit of equipment, and some of them grow to 4,000 square feet, you know, of rental space. So it's really an exciting time for us. That's it for now.
That's great. Thank you. So speaking of space, and especially new space, Matt, can you tell us what made you and Taconic enter this arena, and how did you decide what kind of space, and you know, that whole story?
Absolutely. So as I mentioned during intros, Taconic is focused and investing only in New York City as a geographic area. And so historically we have, you know, we've invested in several different industries as they've emerged in New York City. Years ago, it was data, telecom, you know, office and retail are sort of the bread and butter. But within those, you know, getting more specific, tech office, for example, medical office, and obviously the latest is life science. And I think ultimately we believe in New York City. You know, there's various reasons why talent wants to be here, given the attributes of the city. But with respect to life sciences, I think it began with the robust demand drivers that are here. And Carlo mentioned all of them, and Christina, and you know, the institutions that are here, the foundations that are here, Blood Center, New York Stem Cell, et cetera. So I think it was a combination of understanding the fundamentals, understanding perhaps why it hadn't quite taken off yet. Some of that was a real estate challenge. So ultimately, as we've done with other sectors in the past, is we saw the challenge, we understood the real estate specific components of that. And so our goal is to create solutions to that. Our first investment, the New York, at the Hudson Research Center, which, by the way, we acquired it not to be life science. It was a great flexible building that could be many things. But when we saw the need, when stem cell came to us, we learned that our building was well suited for it. And in all of the important areas where when you look at the feasibility, zoning, ceiling heights, the ability to put an enormous amount of infrastructure on the roof, bring the verticals down to the floor, et cetera, the building was well suited to it. So what we're now doing, both at HRC as well as at our new project, we have a vision where we're seeking to create space for the whole cross section. So I think, you guys we've talked about the legs of the stool. Bill mentioned how each of them have very specific needs depending on where you are. We like to see that whole mix within a building. I think that's what we mean when we say ecosystem. Christina touched on how the various components react to each other. The early stage are spinning out of institutions. Big pharma wants to be near that. They get to see what the investment pipeline looks like in terms of new innovation. So we want to create spaces where incubators can exist. We're currently in our main focus is on plug and play, pre-built, whether you call them graduation labs or step out labs, where early stage companies can come in, many of them venture backed. They're still in the early rounds of their technology and proof of concept, but they need plug and play solutions. They need speed to market. That's what we're currently focused on. So we've built 15,000 feet. We've got 100 that is in planning and construction. We're delivering the next chunk of space, 32,000 feet, in July of this year. And then the next floor of that, which will be another 30,000 by the end of the year. So this is an environment that is, as Bill mentioned, wet labs that are designed for ultimate flexibility. So whether you're biology, whether you're chemistry, and whether you have sort of an offshoot within that biomanufacturing, we seek to create the most flexible space, which often involves additional investment upfront, but it makes it future-proof. And again, it can be for the variety of tenant types that we've talked about. But ultimately, we're seeking to create space for everyone. And in that, we're creating an ecosystem, not only within each building, but also if you look at where our projects are located on the west side of Manhattan, we have sort of a cluster unto itself that we're really excited about for a variety of reasons. One, just the different companies coming together, creating a community, but also for line of sight into growth and things of that nature. So ultimately it was, and again, New York Stem Cell in the early days, working with Carlo and his team, and I forget the exact timeline. Some of you still might have been at EDC, but we started those discussions back in 2016. We have been very active in the sector since. We have always been big believers in New York, and very much so for this sector. When you look at all the demand drivers, and this was all pre-COVID. During COVID, this is one of the sectors du jour. I think everyone's focused on it now. We think that there was considerable momentum pre, and it's only been accelerated during. We've not seen any slowdowns. We have over 100,000 square feet of active prospect negotiations happening right now, which would be all the space that we have available. So we've been at it for a few years. We are big believers. We've seen it accelerate, and obviously we're investing in the next project. So that's the sort of role that we play is to create these environments for groups like Ken and institutions like Weill Cornell and the like to come together. And we think that there is considerable growth for New York City. The many projects that are now starting to deliver merely create an opportunity for it to take off. It wasn't quite there before, as you've all talked about with the timeline. So we couldn't be more excited.
Great, thank you. So that segs nicely into our next question. We wanted to talk about, we wanted to ask Bill, there was this lack of space for such a long time, right? That was really one of the biggest hurdles. hence the life science infrastructure study, hence the initiative. So how are we doing now, Bill, in terms of that supply? And then we'll talk about demand as well.
Yeah, I think we're doing incredibly well. Our own stats show that there's about 1.5 million square feet that's going to be delivered in calendar year 21. So that's really, it's about 180,000 square feet at the Alexandria Center in Long Island City. They have, I should say, redeveloped kind of a typical Long Island City industrial building. They've repurposed it for life science. I've toured it a couple times. It's beautiful space. Janus Property Company up in West Harlem is developing the Tasty building. I put a little bit of an asterisk on Tasty in that while Janus is very open to a life science use here, they have not gone ahead and kind of spec'd out the base building infrastructure kind of necessary for life science. So it's in a little bit of a different category than certainly the Alexandria building. What Matt has done at 619 West 54th Street and what they will be doing at 125 West End and certainly the Deerfield and King Street properties. Himmel and Mehringhoff, somewhat similar. They have a building at 525 West 57th Street. They are going to, they've fairly recently begun kind of marketing it for life science use. My understanding is that they're going to pre-build some space there. Thor Equities, somewhat ironic. It's actually in New Jersey, but because it's in Jersey City and only about 10 minutes from the World Trade Center, we consider that as part of our catchment area. They have a 350,000 square foot building that's going to be kind of, again, repurposed for life science. The Deerfield building at 345 Park South, I think someone had alluded to that earlier. Deerfield is actually moving its headquarters from 780 3rd Avenue to Midtown South. In addition, they're really kind of creating a great atmosphere for life science. They're going to be building out some space for their own companies. They had recently done a deal with a company called Protara, but then they'll also have significant space for kind of third-party leasing. And then the King Street GFP building in Long Island City that I mentioned that we're involved with, it's about 267,000 square feet over 6 stories, right in the heart of Court Square. I'm a little bit biased, of course. It's a great sponsor, great value, and a great location. And we've also had tremendous interest in that building. And then I think just that's about 1.5 million square feet right there. And then the other kind of 100 is the 96,000 or square feet that Matt and his team are adding on to 619 West 54th Street. So about 1.6 million square feet in total delivering this year. And then to Ken's point, there are a number of other projects. Ken and Matt both have kind of projects in the offing, still a couple years out. And then there continue to be rumors about a number of other projects. Alexandria is talking about a 3rd tower on the existing Manhattan campus. They have a number of other properties, both in Manhattan and even a second site in Long Island City.
Yeah, I think when we have this panel again in a year or 2 or 3, that timeline is going to get a lot more filled up, right? So we're going to have some. So Christina, can you tell us about Weill Cornell and maybe, if you're speaking for the other AMIs as well, in terms of how your demands affect the market, how your presence affects the market?
Yeah, I mean, I think for Weill Cornell, so we've been a medical school in New York City for over 120 years. We, are obviously never going to leave the city, unlike, say, other other companies that eventually do leave. And so we've always, looked for space in New York City, specifically, like I mentioned, near the academic medical center that is, paramount. It's also really hard to find space, as I'm sure Ken knows. There's a reason that Cornell is next to MSK, which is next to Rockefeller, which is next to the Blood Center, which is only a few blocks away from Lenox Hill and Mount Sinai, and I'm sure I'm forgetting others. But so in terms of our demand, research is a really important component of our three-part mission. It's in our mission statement to research. And so, we, our campus itself is, constricted, and we are starting to outgrow it. We did open our brand new Belfer Research Building about 10 years ago. But as we look for space off campus, I think that's something that people are sort of more open to. I think, like I said, there is really, I think, in the academic world, a real strong bias towards staying on the campus, not going that far, not, wanting to leave the campus. And so that does take a lot of sort of persuading and handholding to get, whether they be doctors or researchers to leave, medical doctors or researchers to leave the main campus. So as we look for new space, the quality of the laboratory really matters, and sort of the clustering really is important. Who else will be there? That's always a question I get asked by researchers when we're looking for space, is who else is in the building? And that really does matter to them, both from just, the types of collaborations that they can create, as well as just who else is there. And I think, you see that with all of the medical centers, sort of that they've always wanted to stay where they were, but are kind of forced to move out because there just isn't the space. And I think that is something that is pushing us to look, farther afield. Proximity to our main campus, though, is really important. That is a vital thing. I can't imagine we would ever go to New Jersey because of how far that physically is from the main campus, because the proximity to the main campus, what is important, and that can be via transit, but there has to be sort of a quick, logical explanation for why we are where we are.
Right. And just a quick clarification, your purview, is it medical space for the clinical staff as well as research space?
Yeah, so I oversee all of our commercial real estate. So we have about 1 million square feet of research, and by research I mean wet bench research, because we do also have dry lab, and there's internal debates about really internally at Cornell, for my real estate portfolio, do we categorize that as office? Because really, Bill said it's glorified office space. It's just office space. It's not even glorified. Right. And then I also do oversee the clinical, and that is a greater, there's a desire to be near the patient. So that's not a hard sell to get people to get medical doctors to open up a facility, farther from the campus, because that's about being near the patients. We actually this month opened up 3 new locations. So we are definitely plugging full steam ahead with the medical part of it.
Great. Okay. Yeah, because I think while there is, there's maybe some overlap. There is the distinction between healthcare and medical clinical space, where you're seeing patients, and the research space. And listen, the big, for a few years now, translational medicine, that bench to bedside, has been really a focus, but it is 2 different types of spaces. So
they're 2, from a real estate perspective, they are 2 totally different types of spaces. I mean, I think from, Cornell is, like I said, we pride ourselves on our physician scientists, and we are a bench to bedside type of, facility. But in terms of the physical qualities of the space, they are very different. The HVAC requirements are just so much more on the laboratory, the layout, the fire, the safety, the floor loading, things like that. Whereas at the medical, there is also actually a great HVAC need as well, but it's different. And actually, I think it's HVAC is really the big thing that always ends up being the stickler in a lot of our leases, actually. And I think, I can't remember who made the comment, but like one of the things we do when we look at spaces, we do a really extensive deep dive on the HVAC of the building before we determine whether or not that's a space for us, both from a clinical and a research perspective.
Okay, yeah, and I think that maybe, we're going a little off script here, but to something that Bill talked about earlier when he was talking about the supply. This idea, there's plug and play, right? Like Matt was talking about. There's sort of, I sign the lease and I'm a scientist, I can sign the lease and walk in tomorrow and start doing my work, right? And then there's lab ready buildings, and then there's lab friendly buildings. So I don't know if Matt or Bill or anyone wants to talk about that distinction, just to understand the sort of levels. And a lot of it has to do with that infrastructure.
Yeah,
go ahead.
So plug and play, I think, is one end of the spectrum. As you said, that's got all of the infrastructure and all of the lab casework, the benches, fume hoods, et cetera. I think some of these terms are not so clear, but I think generally what lab ready means is that the infrastructure or the backbone is in place. So as Christina said, HVAC is the biggest driver of feasibility. You need significant air handler systems, or whatever the specific system is, but significant, and it's mainly driven by the fact that in lab environments, you have once through air in a significant volume. So you need to get air to the floors. You need to get exhaust. So in your fume hood environment, and also accounting for the once through, you need to get significant exhaust amounts out of the building, typically to the roof where you have cannon fans or the like. So that brings up the verticality of it, the mechanical verticals. So air down, exhaust out, acid neutralization is another component. All plumbing fixtures within a lab environment need to go into an acid neutralization. So that's before you talk about significant electric load and generator. So lab ready buildings have those components in place, and you're ready to fit out the interior as the tenant would need. Lab friendly or lab hopeful or some of those other terms are capable buildings where lab capable, they're buildings that you have some of the fundamental attributes. So do you have roof space? Do you have the vertical possibilities? Do you have power, et cetera? I think the distinctions come into play when you look at those opportunities of have the landlords done the actual engineering studies with engineering teams that know it. Do you actually have a plan, and do you have a handle on how much that'll cost and the time frame to do so? But that's, I think, the high levels of those various categories.
Yeah, that's great. And I think, listen, it sounds, Matt, when you were talking about sort of the trajectory and the path that Taconic took, it's a steep learning curve, it sounds like, but it's also a long one. There's a lot to learn, right? So it's not, it's a lot of risk. It's a lot of investment. So you really want, I'm always saying this as a project manager I'm not a scientist, I'm not an architect, I'm not a, designer, all those letters after my name, but I know there are some really, really great firms in the city, and you have to have those folks on your team, right? Really the folks who know what they're doing, who've done it before.
100%.
And yeah, right.
Yeah,
so,
and there's. I was just going to say, there's definitely a learning curve to the physical side of it, but also, from a leasing perspective and an ownership structuring, you're going to hear on the early stage side of things, tenants are looking for shorter term only because their funding may necessitate it, their growth plans may necessitate it. So you look at the sort of tension between significant investment, shorter term leases, not your traditional credit tenancy type. These are all things that you hear about that come into we'll say the learning curve on the feasibility and structuring and financial side as well.
Yasmeen, I was just going to add to that. I think that's a real crucial factor. The kind of quote unquote typical tenant, typical life science tenant in New York is probably less than 10 or 15,000 square feet. They don't have a back office staff to handle real estate. Typically they need when they need space, they need it very fast, right? It's going to be driven off of one or two milestones, whether it's kind of a funding threshold, they get their Series A, or they go from their Series A to Series B, or they hit some kind of regulatory threshold, they get their FDA approval, and they need space instantly. And to Matt's point about the growth trajectory of these tenants. When you're designing space, you have to incorporate a lot of salvage value into it, because a company, it's very, very rare that a company will kind of live to see the end of its lease. Hopefully they'll outgrow the space oftentimes. And there's examples, recent examples in New York City about companies that just didn't make it. So you want to have a team, whether it's engineering, architecture, to really kind of help you design space so that there's residual value after that first tenant vacates.
Yeah, and I was just going to throw in, and he didn't pay me to say this, but even the broker, right? So to Matt's point about what types of space to look for,
especially
what to look for in a lease. So, so you certainly want someone who knows what he's doing. So I think it's time for questions now. Did we want to, Courtney, were we going to ask questions out of the chat, or did people want to put their cameras on if they had a question? How are we doing this?
Yes, if people could flip their cameras on if they're asking the question. We also have a list of questions that were asked in the chat as well.
So Yasmeen, if you just want to look at them and pick them out, and I think that'd be the best way to go.
Oh, you're muted, Yasmeen.
I'm on fire today. Lisa McGregor from Jacobs had a question about pharma and demand. Is Lisa still here? Okay.
Let me just, I'll just kind of take that without her actually asking it, but I'll tell you this, is that, we did a virtual tour last week for one of the major pharma companies. And we did it with a scientist, a very senior scientist, and their one of the real estate facilities directors. And I was promised a half hour, and this is a meeting that I really had to kind of claw for. And the meeting went for about an hour and 15 minutes. And so I'm not saying that this is a deal that's going to happen imminently, but I was actually very surprised by how kind of receptive they were to it. And, one of the things that we really talked about, and this goes exactly to her question about with, kind of typical suburban campuses. I saw someone else asked a question about Long Island City and Amazon. And I think that they're very related in that I think that companies are looking to attract a very young, sophisticated workforce. We're all hoping that COVID is, I was going to say a blip. It's obviously more than a blip. But we're hoping that this is kind of a pause and not a real harbinger of things to come and people fleeing the city for a lot of reasons. But we think that that's the case. And I think that, for the same reasons that young people have always wanted to come to cities, after a brief pause, we think that they'll be back. So yes, there has been interest from big pharma.
Yeah, I'm just going to add to that in terms of Long Island City. I mean, I'm a little biased myself now after having done a feasibility study for the Long Island City Partnership a couple of years ago. I didn't know what was there. There is so much there. And the one thing about, I guess, the Amazon question, what I'm learning, I talk to small companies all the time, and I'm always looking for more to talk to, because I'm the type of, my role as a project manager, when they, again, hit a big milestone, they have real estate questions, I'm the one to hold their hand through them. But what I'm hearing is that in terms of talent, and I know there's a question in there about talent versus, say, Boston, the small startups used to compete with big pharma and academia for talent, and now more and more they are seeming to compete with the likes of an Amazon and a Google and a Facebook for talent, right? So I think the same, to Bill's point, the things that drew Amazon to Long Island City are also drawing life science there as well, and to New York in general. I mean, again, it's the center of the universe, right? So who wouldn't want to be here? There was a question about zoning. So if maybe, I don't know if Carlo can speak to that, but there was a piece that Pat Sullivan and Elise Wagner put out last week in Cranes about, should zoning be friendlier? What does it look like? Last week there was also a panel from Millrose that a couple of us were on and talking about that. But Carlo, do you have any thoughts about zoning and where the city's thinking is on that?
Yeah, I mean, certainly right now we are at a point where we're looking to see where further modifications to zoning regulations might be necessary for specifically the wet lab development. But I could speak to 2016 and our efforts to at least clarify together with DCP and DOB the existing language and to make it friendlier, I would say, through that interpretation that we issued out in 16 to developers in terms of developing wet lab space. And so you might remember before that point in time, at best, it was unsure whether or not one could develop in a C6 or a C5 or even a C4 wet lab space. Even if you wanted to develop it in C6, you would have to go for what was called at the time a special permit for R&D, which is what was issued for, I believe, the Cornell Tech campus on Roosevelt Island, as well as for the C6 zone of the Alexandria Center. But Christina and Yasmeen, you could probably correct me for accuracy there. Moving forward, though, after several meetings with DOB and DCP, we came to the conclusion that wet lab R&D is effectively at the scales of what we were talking about, no different than a microbrewery in terms of complexity and industrial equipment. And so we came to the determination that it should be allowed as of right in C6 and C8, and I think even as deep as C4. But understandably, and Matt and Bill, you could probably speak well to this, that industrial stock, M1 stock buildings actually lend themselves better to life sciences space and applications than a typical retrofit of a C5 or a C6 zone building. And then I guess moving forward to the primary point of the question, Yasmeen, we're all ears in terms of what else is needed, if it's more of expediters needing help, or whether it's further deeper clarification or even amendments or changes to the zoning, either in a particular neighborhood or citywide. That's something we're keen on hearing.
Yeah, I would just add to what Carla said. The M zone buildings are they tend to work out really, really well for this, right? It's the floor loading, it's the ceiling height, it's the loading dock. I think I'm not an architect by any means, but I think a lot of people will tell you that kind of a short, fat building is better than a tower. Matt had kind of alluded to this when he was speaking about it's just much easier and less costly to run your system through a 10-story building than it is a 20-story building. I would just say kind of parenthetically about Long Island City, as companies and institutions like Christina's think about clustering, it's much easier to be confident about a cluster when the zoning is as of right. And so that's because of the industrial heritage that you find in Long Island City, where most of Long Island City is actually zoned for M. It's very easy to kind of make that argument that you won't be a pioneer there. Matt has actually done that really successfully. 619 West 54th Street is in an M zone, and there are parts of the city, especially on the edges, that are also zoned for manufacturing.
Ken, along those lines, is your site, what is that zoned? And I know you're going through a ULURP, so if you can't speak to that, I'm just wondering about the zoning and how that affects your plans.
In Long Island City, we're in an M zone, but in Manhattan, we're in an R zone. In a C zone, commercial zone. And we're mid-block, so there are some challenges there, and that's why we're going through the ULURP. But we've been there since the 60s. We have all the infrastructure that Christina, Bill, and Matt mentioned. All the waste systems, et cetera, et cetera. So I think we'll, we're hopeful that we'll be able to expand the facility there because it's right where it has to be, right near so many other large academic institutions where if you can get them, as Christina said, to get them to walk a few blocks to another facility for their startups, it's really quite an advantage.
That's great. Courtney, do we have a little more time, or are people willing to go over?
We do, as per the Zoom. I don't want to speak on behalf of the panelists, but I'll leave it to your discretion, and anybody that's interested can remain on.
Okay. Mindy Williams.
I've got like 5 minutes.
Yeah, we can do a couple minutes. Mindy
Sure.
Williams asked about demand, and I know we talked about it a little bit. So maybe Bill and anyone can speak to it. I know from my end, again, I've been tracking companies that are getting funding, right? And so through this pandemic, I've been really, really pleased to see how many companies are getting funded, especially in New York, and some really, really big numbers, right? So generally that means a company needs to, again, grow, hire people, move to new space, new equipment, new capital investments, things like that. I think that speaks to the incentives, right, that play into that, because there are city and state incentives that can support that growth. So I don't know. I mean, I'm very optimistic. Anyone else?
Yeah, I'm also very optimistic. We're tracking demands. It's funny, we just had a sales meeting yesterday, Newmark sales meeting, and we have a tenant in the market list that is everyone kind of sees, and it's very it's fairly accurate. It's much harder to kind of document and quantify demands for life science space. We're tracking about 1 million square feet. Not all of that is going to kind of come to pass. Some of it is kind of chunked out in larger tranches. Columbia University, for instance, is thought to be one of the largest tenants out there. We track down to 1,500, 2,000 square feet. I think one of the most kind of significant drivers of demand, it's something that we talked about kind of earlier, and I wanted to circle back to. It's actually the incubators. If you look to the example of Boston, and Boston has all of the incubators that we do. They have biolabs, they have J labs, they have launch labs, and then they have a couple of others that we don't have yet. But for argument's sake, if those incubators total in aggregate, let's call it 200,000 square feet, the companies that graduate from those incubators will demand anywhere from 3 to 4x, so 600 to 800,000 square feet of space on an annual basis. So it's really, really significant. And the multiple that we get here in New York isn't going to be nearly that high, but because our inventory is so low comparatively, the bump that we'll get out of the incubators will be very significant. And we're already seeing that. There's been two companies that have graduated from biolabs that are taking significant chunks of space in buildings, and there are others that will follow them. So that gives me a lot of hope.
Yeah, and in
Absolutely.
particular, Bill, when you consider that, I think biolabs and J labs have been open for 12 months.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah,
So
exactly.
those are relatively new. And I echo that. We've seen significant demand from tenants coming out of those already within 12 months. We had figured this would take 2 years, 3 years. The average size that they're spinning out into is 10, 15, 20,000 in some cases. So if you look at the multiples of both square footage, there's real organic growth and I think real pent up demand before you even talk about where the next wave of growth comes from. And I think if you look at the occupancy rates in the incubators, there's probably more of those needed immediately as well. So very hopeful.
Yeah.
Indeed.
Yasmeen,
Yeah, so we want to wrap this up, I think. So I just wanted to throw just two super quick. There's a really good question about about resources and researchers and connecting the community a little bit more. So I think I could talk about that for days. So I think maybe that's another panel that we bring in, that we put together. And there's another question about HVAC. So I think that this is a great discussion. I think that once I finally joined it, there's so much more to talk about. So feel free to reach out. I think we'll work with Tommy. Maybe we'll do this again. So thank you.
Thank you all. This was a really great discussion. This is Margot Jaffa. I'm with All Steel. Just want to give a really big thank you to all the speakers today. It was a great discussion, very informative in terms of the insights on this topic. Thank you to all the participants. We appreciate you joining today as well. And hopefully we'll see some of your faces later today at the Cornet New Year's party this evening.
Thank you.
Thank you all.
Great.
Thanks,
Thank
Margaret.
you.
Hey, have a big thank you to the committee for putting this together.
Absolutely. Thanks.
Agreed. Thank you.
Thank you.
Bye.